The first time she said I should hand over free diesel, the only sound that followed was the steady slap of water against the marina pilings, like the harbor itself was waiting to see how I would respond. And I remember thinking that people reveal their entire character in the first unreasonable demand they make out loud. My name is Nathaniel Brooks, and I operate a private marina valued at $3 million on the edge of a protected coastal inlet, where every vessel docking, fueling, and maintenance record is tracked under strict maritime compliance standards, not neighborhood opinion. I was standing on the main dock that morning reviewing fuel logs when Karen Mitchell arrived without announcement, stepping out of a white SUV with the kind of confidence that does not come from ownership, but from assumption, followed by two HOA representatives carrying clipboards, as if paperwork could override jurisdiction. She did not greet me. She pointed instead toward the fuel station and said the marina's community obligation required temporary allocation of marine diesel for resident use, delivered in a tone that suggested the word temporary meant optional only for me, not for her. The air smelled like salt, diesel vapor, and morning fog drifting in from the harbor channel, and I remember the distant hum of generators powering dock systems while I asked her to clarify what regulation she was referring to. She responded by saying the Homeowners Association had passed an Emergency Resource Accessibility Directive, which did not exist in any municipal or maritime authority database I recognized. I told her the marina operated under federal and state fuel handling compliance codes, and she replied that community governance had priority for shared shoreline infrastructure. That was the moment I realized this was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to redefine control through repetition. Behind her, one of the HOA representatives nodded, as if agreement could substitute for legal standing. I looked past them toward the fuel dock, where a commercial vessel was already scheduled to refuel, its captain waiting with engines idling, unaware that a dispute over entitlement was unfolding on the dock above him. Karen stepped closer and said she expected immediate compliance, adding that refusal would be reported as obstruction of community access rights. Then she lifted her phone and made a call that she clearly believed would escalate pressure in her favor. The marina remained operational around us, radios crackling with docking instructions, ropes tightening against cleats, the routine rhythm of maritime work continuing as if unaware it had been drawn into someone else's argument. I asked her one final time who she believed had authority over fuel distribution in a licensed marina facility, and she answered without hesitation that the Homeowners Association had jurisdiction over all coastal resources within visual boundary lines of the community. I remember the exact stillness that followed that statement, not because it was correct, but because it revealed how far confidence can travel without verification. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply reached for my radio and placed a single call to confirm operational oversight protocol, because in my experience, systems do not respond to demands, they respond to hierarchy, and what she was standing on was not hers to define. The harbor wind shifted slightly as I waited for the response, and for the first time since she arrived, Karen Mitchell stopped speaking, not because she was finished, but because she realized I was no longer engaging her on her level of authority. I remained on the dock longer than I intended, not because the situation required hesitation, but because I wanted to see how far Karen Mitchell would push an authority structure that had no confirmed foundation, and in my experience, people like her always reveal the limits of their confidence when they are forced to wait for verification instead of applause. The radio in my hand crackled once, then connected, and I gave a short operational check request to confirm jurisdictional oversight for marina fuel distribution under active licensing compliance, keeping my voice calm and procedural, not emotional, because emotion does not stabilize systems, procedure does. Karen watched me make the call with a tightening expression, her arms crossed in a posture that suggested expectation rather than concern, as if she believed any communication I made would ultimately loop back into her authority claim. The harbor continued functioning around us, boats shifting slightly against their moorings, crew members moving along the piers, fuel hoses coiled and ready for scheduled operations, all of it unaffected by the argument unfolding at the center of Dock 3. One of the marina technicians approached quietly and asked if there was a delay in fueling authorization, and I told him to hold standard operations until confirmation came through, which caused Karen to immediately step forward and say that no private operator had the right to suspend community fuel access. I corrected her once, stating that the marina was not a community utility but a regulated private facility under maritime fuel handling certification, and she responded by repeating that the Homeowners Association had voted to include shoreline resources under shared emergency provisions. Her assistant nodded again, reinforcing a claim that had no visible documentation attached to it. I could feel the pattern forming now, not as chaos, but as structured overreach, a belief system attempting to replace jurisdiction through repetition and pressure. A few minutes later, the radio responded, and the voice on the other end identified itself as Port Authority Compliance Coordination, confirming that all fuel operations were strictly controlled under marina licensing and federal maritime guidelines, with no external community governance authority over operational fuel distribution. The shift in atmosphere was immediate, not dramatic, but precise, like a lock aligning with the correct key after being forced for too long. I did not look at Karen right away. I simply acknowledged the confirmation, then instructed operations to resume normal scheduling with no interruption to commercial vessels waiting at the dock. When I finally turned toward her, she was still holding her phone, but the confidence she had arrived with was no longer supported by anything external. I told her calmly that the marina did not operate under Homeowners Association directives, and that any future requests for fuel allocation would need to go through proper regulatory channels, not informal community enforcement. One of the HOA representatives attempted to respond, but stopped mid-sentence when I raised my hand slightly, not in anger, but in finality. The harbor noise returned to normal rhythm around us. Engines starting, ropes tightening, water slapping gently against concrete pilings, as if the environment itself had resumed its correct operating state after a temporary misclassification of authority. Karen lowered her phone slightly, looking toward the fuel dock where operations had already resumed without her input. And for the first time since she arrived, she did not issue another demand, because the system she was trying to override had already confirmed it would not be overridden. I stayed on the dock after the radio confirmation, not because anything was unresolved, but because I wanted to observe how quickly authority collapses when it is forced to stop speaking in assumptions and start responding to verified structure. And Karen Mitchell was still standing near the fuel station pretending that nothing fundamental had shifted. The marina continued its normal cycle around us, a tanker vessel edging closer to its assigned berth, crew members adjusting lines, the smell of salt water mixing with diesel vapor drifting across the pier, and yet the tension at Dock 3 remained concentrated around a single misunderstanding of jurisdiction. Karen took a step forward again, and said that the Port Authority must have misunderstood the community directive because she insisted that the Homeowners Association had already submitted formal documentation requesting shared fuel allocation rights during peak seasonal demand, and she said it with enough confidence that someone unfamiliar with maritime compliance might have hesitated. I asked her to present the document, not verbally but physically, because in regulated environments nothing exists until it is recorded, stamped, and traceable through official channels, and she paused for the first time since arriving. Her assistant began scrolling through a tablet, then stopped, then tried again, but I could see from his expression that whatever he was searching for did not exist in any validated system. The harbor wind shifted slightly, pushing against the dock structure, and I noticed the fuel hoses swaying gently, still connected to operational systems that had never been paused in their regulatory scope, only in Karen's expectation of control. A second radio transmission came through, this time confirming that marina fuel operations were not subject to any external residential governance, and that any attempted restriction or reallocation request from non-licensed entities would be logged as procedural interference, not policy enforcement. I did not react outwardly. I simply acknowledged the transmission and instructed the technician to continue standard fueling operations for the vessel currently waiting at berth. That was the moment Karen's posture changed slightly, not in defeat, but in recalculation, as if she was attempting to rebuild authority from the fragments that were no longer being accepted. She stated that the Homeowners Association would escalate the matter to municipal oversight, and I told her calmly that municipal oversight had already been notified during licensing verification protocols when the marina was registered, and that all authority boundaries had been predefined in that process. The phrase seemed to unsettle her more than disagreement would have, because it removed ambiguity entirely. A dock supervisor approached and quietly confirmed that all fueling systems were operating normally under compliance clearance, and I watched as Karen looked from him to the vessel to the fuel station, realizing that nothing around her was responding to her presence as a controlling factor. Her phone remained in her hand, but she did not make another call. Instead, she asked if I understood what consequences non-compliance could bring to community relations, and I replied that I was not managing community relations. I was managing a licensed maritime facility operating under federal fuel distribution regulation. The distinction was not emotional, it was structural. One of the HOA representatives attempted to speak again, but stopped when the tanker vessel signaled readiness and operations proceeded without interruption, the sound of fuel systems engaging echoing across the dock in a steady mechanical rhythm. Karen stepped back slightly for the first time, not physically removed, but functionally excluded from the process unfolding in front of her, and I realized then that the conflict was never about fuel at all. It was about whether authority can exist through assertion alone or whether it must survive contact with verification, and on this dock, verification had already spoken. I remained at the edge of the fuel dock after operations resumed, not because anything required my physical presence there, but because I wanted to observe how long it would take for Karen Mitchell to accept that the system she was trying to influence was no longer responsive to her interpretation of authority. The Marina returned to its normal rhythm almost immediately, vessels aligning with assigned berths, fuel hoses operating under standard calibration, and dock staff continuing their procedures without hesitation, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief misclassification of jurisdiction. Karen stood near the concrete edge of the pier, her posture still upright, but noticeably less anchored than before, watching the tanker vessel complete its fueling cycle under confirmed authorization. She attempted once more to reframe the situation, stating that the Homeowners Association would be filing a formal complaint regarding denial of community resource access, but her voice no longer carried the same certainty it had earlier. I asked her again to specify the legal basis for her claim, not as a challenge, but as a procedural requirement, and she hesitated in a way that revealed there was no structured reference behind her statement. The harbor environment continued to function independently of her argument. Wind moving across the water, metallic sounds of dock equipment engaging, and the steady presence of regulated operations reinforcing the boundary between assumption and authority. A second confirmation arrived over the radio, this time from Regional Maritime Compliance Oversight, reaffirming that all Marina fuel distribution remains strictly under licensed operational control and that any external claims of shared entitlement had no regulatory standing. I acknowledged the transmission without delay and instructed the dock team to continue full operational scheduling for the remaining vessels. That instruction alone appeared to shift the atmosphere further, because it signaled that there would be no suspension, no negotiation pause, and no procedural ambiguity introduced to accommodate external pressure. Karen looked toward her assistant, who was still holding his tablet but no longer actively searching for any supporting documentation, and I could see the moment she began to understand that the framework she relied on did not extend into this environment. She said that the situation would be escalated to higher community governance channels, but I responded calmly that all escalation pathways relevant to this facility were already predefined within maritime regulatory structure and that none of those pathways included Homeowners Association jurisdiction. The distinction was not emotional, it was administrative, and that distinction mattered more than any verbal insistence. The dock supervisor approached briefly to confirm that all fueling operations were proceeding under standard compliance review, and I observed Karen's reaction shift from expectation to reassessment as she realized that no one around her was reacting to her authority claims as valid operational input. She attempted to speak again, but paused mid-sentence when another vessel signaled docking readiness, and the Marina continued its workflow without interruption. I noticed then that her presence on the dock had transitioned from active influence to passive observation, and the system she believed she could redirect was functioning exactly as designed without acknowledging her input as operationally relevant. The water against the pilings remained steady, the fuel lines remained engaged, and the harbor continued its regulated rhythm, reinforcing the final realization that authority in this space was not declared, it was verified. I stayed on the dock long after the second wave of confirmations came through the radio, not because there was anything left to verify, but because I wanted to observe the final stage of behavioral transition when an imposed authority structure realizes it is no longer being treated as valid input. The marina had fully returned to operational rhythm, vessels arriving and departing on schedule, fuel systems cycling through standard load and discharge sequences, and dock personnel moving with uninterrupted procedural discipline as if the earlier disruption had never been anything more than a temporary anomaly in communication. Karen Mitchell remained near the edge of the pier, no longer advancing, no longer issuing demands, but still holding her phone in a position that suggested she was waiting for a response that would restore her original expectation of control. Her assistant stood slightly behind her, tablet lowered now, not actively searching for supporting documentation anymore, which itself was a silent acknowledgement that no such documentation existed within any verifiable system. The wind moved across the harbor in steady intervals, carrying the faint scent of diesel and salt water, and I could hear the mechanical pulse of the marina's fuel pumps continuing without deviation, reinforcing the reality that operations here were governed by licensing structure, not community interpretation. I asked Karen once more to identify the regulatory framework she believed granted the Homeowners Association authority over marine fuel distribution, and she responded with a repetition of terms like community provision rights and shoreline shared access principles, none of which aligned with any maritime or federal compliance code governing licensed fuel facilities. I did not interrupt her immediately because I wanted to see how long a system built on assumption could sustain itself when faced with procedural silence instead of resistance. A dock supervisor passed behind me and confirmed that all fueling operations were continuing under full compliance clearance, and I acknowledged the update without altering my position. That moment seemed to register more strongly than any direct correction, because it reinforced that operational truth was being confirmed externally, not negotiated internally. Karen attempted to escalate again, stating that municipal oversight would be contacted to review the marina's refusal to comply with community resource directives. But I informed her calmly that municipal oversight had already been integrated into the licensing framework at the time of facility certification and that no external residential governance structure held authority over fuel allocation within regulated maritime infrastructure. The distinction was not framed as argument, but as operational fact. The harbor continued its rhythm without interruption, ropes tightening against cleats as another vessel prepared for departure, radios transmitting routine docking instructions, and the entire system functioning as if no parallel claim of authority had ever been introduced. Karen's posture shifted again, this time less confident, more observational, as she looked between the fuel station, the operating vessels, and the staff who were no longer acknowledging her presence as relevant to decision-making. Her assistant leaned closer and spoke quietly, but she did not respond. I observed that her earlier certainty had not been challenged through confrontation, but through continuity, because nothing she asserted had been reflected back by the system she was attempting to influence. Another compliance confirmation arrived over radio channel, reiterating that all marina operations remained strictly within licensed maritime authority and that external governance claims would be recorded as non-binding. I acknowledged the transmission and authorized continuation of all scheduled fueling operations for the remainder of the dock cycle. At that point, Karen no longer attempted to speak in terms of enforcement, only in terms of disagreement. But disagreement has no functional weight in a system that operates on verification rather than consensus. The marina continued to function without deviation, and I realized that what she had interpreted as authority was never rejected by force. It was simply never recognized as a valid control layer to begin with. I remained on the dock even after the final operational confirmation cycles had stabilized, not because the situation required continued oversight, but because I wanted to observe the final behavioral outcome when an external claimant fully exhausts their ability to influence a system that is not designed to respond to informal authority inputs. The marina had fully normalized its operations, vessels moving in and out under scheduled clearance, fuel systems maintaining regulated pressure and flow without interruption, and dock personnel executing their tasks with the same procedural consistency as before the interaction began. Karen Mitchell stood farther back now, no longer positioned near the fuel station, but closer to the edge of the pedestrian walkway that overlooked the water, her posture less assertive and more observational, as if she was attempting to identify a point in the environment where her earlier claims might still hold residual effect. Her assistant no longer referenced the tablet at all, holding it at his side in a neutral position, indicating that the search for supporting documentation had reached a silent conclusion. The wind across the harbor maintained its steady pattern, and the sound of diesel engines engaging and disengaging at the docking stations continued without deviation, reinforcing the system's independence from external narrative attempts. I received another internal confirmation from compliance coordination indicating that all active operations remained within full maritime regulatory authorization and that no external community governance structures held jurisdiction over fuel allocation, scheduling, or distribution processes. I acknowledged the transmission and allowed operations to proceed without modification. Karen attempted once more to speak, but her words were no longer structured as demands. Instead, they shifted into interpretive statements about fairness and community expectation, neither of which held operational weight within a regulated fuel facility. I listened without interruption, because at this stage interruption would have implied that her statements still occupied the same category as enforceable input, and they did not. A dock supervisor passed behind me and confirmed that the next vessel was cleared for fueling sequence initiation, and I authorized the continuation without delay. That single procedural action appeared to mark the final transition point in the interaction because it demonstrated that decision-making authority was not paused or redirected by her presence. Karen's assistant leaned slightly toward her and spoke quietly, but she did not respond immediately, instead watching the fueling system engage with the next vessel, observing a process that no longer referenced her position in any operational context. I noticed that her earlier confidence had not collapsed dramatically, but rather dissolved incrementally as each attempt to assert jurisdiction failed to produce acknowledgement from any functional layer of the Marina system. Another radio confirmation came through, restating that all operational protocols remained fully compliant with maritime licensing standards and that no external residential association input was recognized within regulatory fuel control frameworks. I acknowledged the message and continued oversight of dock operations without deviation. At that point, Karen finally stepped back from the edge of the pier entirely, no longer attempting to engage in procedural dialogue, and shifted into a silent observational role, which effectively confirmed that her authority claim had reached its operational boundary. The Marina continued its structured rhythm uninterrupted, vessels docking, fueling, and departing according to schedule, and the system maintained full compliance integrity without requiring adjustment or accommodation for external governance claims. In that sustained continuity, the situation resolved itself not through confrontation, but through the absence of any mechanism by which her asserted authority could be processed or applied. I remained on the dock after the final operational cycle stabilized, not because there was any uncertainty left in the system, but because I wanted to observe the final stage of disengagement when an external claimant realizes that persistence no longer produces response from a structure that does not recognize their authority input as valid operational data. The Marina had fully returned to baseline function, vessels arriving and departing under confirmed scheduling clearance, fuel systems operating within regulated pressure parameters, and dock personnel continuing their procedures with uninterrupted consistency, as if the entire interaction with Karen Mitchell had never altered the workflow at all. She stood farther away now, positioned near the outer railing overlooking the harbor channel, no longer attempting to assert directives, but instead observing the Marina operations with a visible recalibration of expectation, as if trying to locate the point where her assumed authority might still attach itself to something tangible. Her assistant no longer interacted with any device, holding the tablet at his side in a passive position, signaling that whatever internal search or validation process they had relied on had reached a definitive endpoint with no supporting result. The wind across the harbor remained steady, carrying faint traces of fuel vapor and salt air, while the mechanical rhythm of dock operations continued without deviation, reinforcing that every process occurring here was governed by licensed maritime structure rather than external community interpretation. I received another compliance confirmation through the radio system, reiterating that all operational activity remained fully aligned with maritime regulatory authorization and that no external residential governance entity held recognized jurisdiction over fueling distribution, scheduling authority, or infrastructure control. I acknowledged the transmission without pause and authorized continuation of all scheduled vessel operations, maintaining standard procedural flow. Karen attempted once more to speak, but her tone had shifted completely from enforcement to reinterpretation, referencing fairness, shared resources, and community expectation, none of which mapped to any operational framework recognized within regulated fuel infrastructure. I allowed the statement to pass without interruption, because at this stage response would imply equivalence between interpretation and authority, and no such equivalence existed in the system governing this facility. A dock supervisor moved behind me and confirmed the next vessel was prepared for fueling sequence initiation, and I approved the operation immediately, reinforcing continuity of workflow without delay or negotiation. That single procedural confirmation appeared to mark the final structural shift in the interaction, because it demonstrated that operational authority was not influenced, paused, or redirected by external verbal assertion. Karen's assistant leaned slightly toward her and spoke in a low tone, but she did not respond immediately, instead watching the fueling process engage with the next vessel as if observing a system that had permanently excluded her input from its decision layers. I noted that her earlier confidence had not collapsed abruptly, but had instead eroded through repeated non-acknowledgement by every functional component of the Marina until it no longer had any structural support. Another transmission arrived confirming continued compliance under federal maritime fuel regulation standards and explicitly restating that external community association directives held no enforceable status within licensed operational control systems. I acknowledged the update and continued oversight without modification. At that point, Karen stepped fully back from the operational edge of the pier, no longer attempting to engage in procedural dialogue, and shifted into a passive observational state, effectively confirming that her authority claim had reached the absolute boundary of system recognition. The Marina continued its uninterrupted rhythm, vessels docking, fueling, and departing according to established schedule, and the entire environment functioned as if no competing governance narrative had ever been introduced, leaving only the consistent reality that authority in this space existed solely through verified regulatory structure rather than asserted entitlement. I remained on the dock after the operational systems had fully stabilized, not because there was any remaining disruption in Marina function, but because I wanted to observe the final stage of disengagement when an external claimant transitions from active assertion into passive observation after every attempt to influence a regulated system has failed to produce recognition. The Marina was now operating at full continuity, vessels moving through scheduled docking sequences, fuel systems maintaining stable calibrated flow, and dock personnel executing standard procedures without interruption or deviation, as if the entire interaction with Karen Mitchell had been absorbed and neutralized by the underlying regulatory structure that governed the facility. She stood at a greater distance now, no longer positioned near the fuel station or operational control points, but instead near the outer railing overlooking the harbor channel, her posture no longer assertive but contained, with her attention focused on the ongoing Marina workflow as if attempting to identify any residual surface where her earlier claims might still attach themselves to functional authority. Her assistant remained beside her, but no longer engaged with any device, holding the tablet at his side in a neutral lowered position, indicating that whatever internal validation process they had been relying on had concluded without producing any actionable support or external confirmation. The wind moved steadily across the harbor, carrying the faint mixture of salt air and residual fuel vapor, while the mechanical rhythm of dock operations continued uninterrupted, reinforcing that all functional activity within this environment was governed exclusively by licensed maritime regulatory structure rather than any external residential governance interpretation. I received another compliance confirmation over the radio system, restating that all Marina fuel operations remained fully within federal maritime authorization standards, and that no external homeowners association or community governance entity held recognized jurisdiction over fuel distribution, scheduling authority, or operational infrastructure control. I acknowledged the transmission without delay and maintained full operational continuity across all dock assignments. Karen attempted once more to speak, but her language had fully transitioned away from enforcement terminology into reinterpretation, referencing fairness frameworks, community entitlement expectations, and shared resource principles, none of which corresponded to any enforceable regulatory category within licensed maritime infrastructure. I allowed the statement to pass without interruption, because at this stage response would imply that interpretation and authority occupied the same functional layer, and in this system, they did not. A dock supervisor moved behind me and confirmed that the next vessel was prepared for fueling sequence initiation under standard clearance, and I authorized the operation immediately, reinforcing uninterrupted procedural continuity. That action marked a final structural point in the interaction, because it demonstrated that operational authority was neither suspended nor influenced by external verbal assertion, but remained entirely self-governed through regulatory compliance validation. Karen's assistant leaned slightly toward her and spoke in a low tone, but she did not respond, instead watching the fueling process engage with the next vessel as if observing a system that had permanently removed her input from its decision architecture. I observed that her earlier confidence had not collapsed in a single moment, but had eroded gradually through repeated absence of recognition from every functional layer of the Marina system until it no longer had any structural support within the operational environment. Another compliance transmission arrived confirming continued adherence to maritime fuel regulation standards and explicitly stating that external community association directives held no enforceable status within licensed operational control systems. I acknowledged the update and continued oversight without modification. At that point, Karen stepped fully away from the operational edge of the pier, no longer attempting to engage in any procedural dialogue, and shifted into a passive observational position, effectively confirming that her authority claim had reached the absolute boundary of system recognition. The Marina continued its uninterrupted operational rhythm, vessels docking, fueling, and departing according to established scheduling protocol, and the entire environment functioned as if no competing governance narrative had ever been introduced, leaving only the consistent reality that authority in this space existed solely through verified regulatory structure rather than asserted entitlement. I remained on the dock even after the Marina had fully returned to uninterrupted operational flow, not because there was any remaining instability in the system, but because I wanted to observe the final behavioral phase of disengagement when an external authority claimant is no longer resisted, argued with, or acknowledged, but simply rendered operationally irrelevant by a system that continues functioning without requiring their input or validation. The harbor had settled into its normal rhythm, vessels arriving and departing according to precise scheduling clearance, fuel systems maintaining stable regulated output, and dock personnel executing standard procedures with full continuity, as if the entire interaction with Karen Mitchell had never introduced any disruption to the operational environment at all. She stood at a distance near the outer edge of the pier, no longer attempting to assert directives or demand compliance, but instead observing the Marina with a posture that had shifted from enforcement to passive assessment, as if she was now attempting to understand where her authority claim had failed to integrate into the structure she believed it could influence. Her assistant remained beside her, but no longer engaged in any form of validation process, holding the tablet at his side in a neutral position that indicated complete absence of supporting documentation within any verifiable regulatory system. The wind moved steadily across the harbor channel, carrying salt air and faint residual fuel vapor, while the mechanical rhythm of dock operations continued without deviation, reinforcing that all functional activity within this environment existed solely within licensed maritime regulatory control and not within any external governance interpretation or community-based enforcement framework. I received a final compliance transmission over the radio system confirming that all marina fuel operations remained fully authorized under federal maritime regulation standards, and that no external homeowners association or community governance entity held recognized jurisdiction over operational control, scheduling authority, or resource distribution within the facility. I acknowledged the transmission without delay and maintained full operational continuity across all remaining dock assignments. Karen attempted one final time to speak, but her language had fully transitioned away from enforcement structure into interpretive framing, referencing fairness, shared entitlement, and community expectation, none of which mapped to any enforceable operational category within regulated maritime infrastructure. I did not respond, because at this stage response would imply that interpretation and authority occupied equivalent functional weight within the system, and they did not. A dock supervisor passed behind me and confirmed that all vessels were operating under standard clearance procedures, and I authorized continuation of fuel sequencing without interruption. That action represented the final operational confirmation that system authority remained entirely internal to regulatory structure and unaffected by external verbal assertion. Karen's assistant leaned slightly toward her and spoke quietly, but she did not respond, instead watching the Marina operations continue without any acknowledgement of her earlier claims, as if observing a system that had permanently excluded her input from its decision architecture. I noted that her confidence had not collapsed in a single moment, but had instead eroded through repeated non-recognition across every functional layer of the Marina until it no longer had any structural support within the operational environment. Another compliance confirmation arrived over radio channels reiterating full adherence to maritime fuel regulation standards and explicitly stating that external community association directives held no enforceable status within licensed operational control systems. I acknowledged the transmission and maintained oversight without modification. At that point, Karen stepped fully away from the operational edge of the pier, no longer attempting to engage in any procedural dialogue, and transitioned into a passive observational position, effectively confirming that her authority claim had reached the absolute boundary of system recognition. The Marina continued its uninterrupted operational rhythm, vessels docking, fueling, and departing according to established scheduling protocols, and the entire environment functioned as if no competing governance narrative had ever been introduced, leaving only the consistent reality that authority in this space existed solely through verified regulatory structure rather than asserted entitlement.